Leaving the village for a moment, the old barn farm conversion was, for many years before conversion, the home of a notable character known as Boxer Clark. This gentleman aroused varying attitudes among older residents, and he is variously described as a rogue, poacher and a rough diamond.
Out at the foss stands the splendid mansion The Grove, built in 1837 by Parson Smith and inhabited by the succession of Smiths until 1928. The great Henry Smith, who exercised such a powerful influence on village life, was born in 1828, married Mary Butler in 1855 and died in 1915. They had 2 children, Henry Jr., who died in 1919, and Butler, who was born in 1858 and died in 1945. Henry Jr.'s son Cuthbert lived at Aslockton, but later moved to Greenways, Hoe Lane, and died in 1979.
Henry Sr. ruled the village, and after the death of George Parr, seems to have become the undisputed squire of the village. By 1871, at the age of 43, he owned 51 cottages out of the 151 houses in the village, and 1/5 of the land in the parish.
He was a paternalistic autocrat, holding the fortunes of his employees and of many of his tenants and neighbours in the palm of his hand, and to cross him was to face the workhouse or worse.
The Foss Road was until 1923 little more than a neglected grassy track, and the stretch which ran through the parish was let to farmers for grazing. It was eventually tarmacked in 1923. Across the foss, another elegant residence, Cropwell Court, was built in 1862 by George Parr and called the Elms. Mr. Ragsdale remembers a party of men and boys going out on Plough Monday, the first Monday after Christmas, when traditionally the ploughboys went round the big houses dressed in fancy trimmings taken from Christmas decorations, and singing the old ploughboys' songs and carols in the hope of collecting money in their tin.
The girls of the village had a similar tradition known as valentining, and they too travelled round the big houses singing and hoping to collect money.
A more recent occupant of the Elms, now called Cropwell Court, was Eric Lancelot Coppleston Pentecost, who moved into the house in 1938 with very little experience of farming, having made his money as owner of a textile business.
He was like a businessman, jumping from one to the other ideas, brainwaves, that never stood still.
Somebody showed me a picture of Belton Galway. It was black and white.
Black and white band right around the middle,
Very long body.
Yes. And then he went for short ones, then of course he mixed them all up and produced his beef builder, which is his own invention.
Was it?
Yes. Yeah. And he actually got it established with a herd book.
Yeah.
I mean, none of those had ever been in the country. No. He created it.
Returning to the village now, the houses on the right side of Radcliffe Road are all relatively modern, until reaching Carver's Close, named, we think, after the Thomas Carver who lived in the village in the last century.
Perhaps the most picturesque house in the village is White Cottage, facing the green, with its thatched roof and curious rustic Gothic window frames. The house is formed by joining up what was the court's groom's cottage to the stables, and the wall between them is relatively recent.
Turning into Back Lane, the very prepossessing building on the left, the court, was during the last century called the Lodge. It belonged to Joseph Marriott Jr. until his death in 1867, and afterwards to his widow. On the Back Lane side, the land was used for vegetables, soft fruit cages and greenhouses. Further up the lane, 2 gates opposite each other gave access to Forth's Orchard on what is now Willowbrook and Rose Bank. Beneath the road runs the culverted dyke into which the children of the village used to climb and hide.
On the corner with the posts, the north corner land was known as Saxton's Yard, and on the south side Baldock's Stackyard. On the corner of Hoe Lane stands a garage that was once a terrace of 3 cottages, latterly called Mrs. Harding's. At the age of 80, Mrs. Harding pursued a vigorous campaign in opposition to Bingham Rural District Council when they proposed to demolish her cottage and rehouse her. Now the cottages have been reduced in size and the end cottage, Mrs. Harding's, has gone. The remaining walls form the garage to Red Hill Cottage. The old fireplace from the original cottage is still in place in the garage.
Hoe Lane leads past bungalows that replaced earlier cottages until we reach the croft, which has been shored up with concrete shoulders along the roadside because it was feared at one time that it would collapse. Opposite, Greenways, the former home of Cuthbert Chapel Smith. In his day, Mr. Smith experimented with the first battery chicken farming, keeping them in the old school, and later in sheds on his land, now occupied by Oak Close. At one time, a fire destroyed the sheds and fowls completely.
Returning to Back Lane, we are now at the Hollies, a red brick farmhouse built in 1841 by Joseph Baldock, farmer and maltster. The house replaced a thatched farmhouse which stood 60 yards to the north, which was taken down in 1842. The buildings that now form the barn conversions, the maltings and Knoll House, were the stables, malt house and barns of the farm. It was in this farm that William Baldock, whose memoirs have provided so much information about village life in the mid-19th century, was born and lived for his whole life.
On the bend of Back Lane stood 5 cottages, now replaced by Swallow's Nest. One was a little shop run by Polly Beat, also known as Miss Marriott, who was also caretaker for the chapel and kept the old village hall clean. They stood next to Peach Cottage, which in the 30s was the home of Mrs. Swain, widow of P.C. Swain, the village bobby.
On the 1788 map of Cropwell Butler, following the enclosures, there is a portion of land marked Chapel Yard, where it's thought the original field chapel stood before it was destroyed during the Reformation. Several relics have been ploughed up at times from the surrounding fields, among them this carved stone which is now in a village garden and appears to be part of a window tracery.
In the 50s, when government policy was to provide decent housing for all, the old mud cottages and others were inspected and 26 were condemned as unsuitable for human habitation. A proposal to replace the cottages with council houses provoked an outcry, and many are still of the opinion that the old cottages could have been renovated and modernised. Eventually, Mr. Sheldon, who was parish council chairman, agreed to make land available at the south end of the village, and the first stage of Butler Close was built. To many of the rehoused villagers, the new houses were a godsend, modern, convenient and secure.
We end our tour at May's Field, owned by the descendants of May Harrison. For years past it had a huge, beautiful elm tree standing on its boundary. It was a casualty of Dutch elm disease and was dying in 1975. Only the dead trunk remains.
not me, 4 hours, but I have a house.
Yeah, I don't know that you should never let girls there.
No, no, yeah.